any expert witness giving testimony, anybody speaking to the prosecutor, certainly victims and witnesses in general, as well as a host of legal professionals. And so these sanctions are much more worrying.
To this executive order, Donald Trump has signed it in the last hour or so, sanctioning the International Criminal Court. Financial and visa restrictions will now be placed on those who assist the ICC in its investigations of American citizens or allies. And this comes after the court issued arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his Defense Minister Gallant, and follows Trump restating his plan for America to take over the Gaza Strip. So lots to digest. Let's talk to Heidi Matthews, Professor of International Law at York University in Canada. Professor Heidi, if I may. First of all, this move to sanction the International Criminal Court. What do you make of Trump's justification?
Yeah, so Trump has done this before, right? In his first go around in the White House, he sanctioned the former prosecutor of the court. She approached that in a very sort of passive way. There wasn't much of a reaction. But these sanctions, or what looks to be what's coming down the road in terms of these sanctions, are far more wide-ranging, right? So the idea that anybody who's assisting the court would be subject to this kind of punishment effectively encompasses perhaps thousands of people, right? Any expert witness giving testimony, anybody speaking to the prosecutor, certainly victims and witnesses in general, as well as a host of legal professionals. And so these sanctions are much more worrying.
Right. And what do you feel about it as an international lawyer, as a criminologist? How much does it delegitimize? Does it damage the ICC?
Yeah, I mean, partly what we need to look at in the days ahead is how other states react, particularly states who are members of the ICC, right? And particularly those states, who have relatively more power vis-a-vis other states. So, I'm thinking about Canada, Germany, the United Kingdom, frankly, those in the global north who might actually be able to have a little bit more persuasive potential with respect to the United States. It really depends on how they act, and particularly how European countries respond, if they do so in a collective and united front to support the court, or whether they sort of pander to Trump. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that, particularly in the UK right now, which is worrying.
Right. And what about Trump's he's been making the news pretty much on the hour ever since he became president again. This notion of Gaza and the legitimacy of his plans for the Strip, that Israel, once the fighting is over, will hand it over to the USA, the population will be resettled somewhere else, and then the US will turn it into some Dubai. Yeah. Where's the legality in that? Well, what does the international law say about this kind of thing?
Yeah, so I mean, international law would say that this is preposterous, and all of these proposed actions would constitute flagrant violations of core principles of international law, and they would also constitute crimes, frankly, that would be covered by ICC jurisdiction. A couple of things here. One, I find it interesting that he talks about when the fighting is over, considering that he's, touting himself and his administration as having been central to securing the first stage of the ceasefire, which is now in effect. And so, this gives me some pause as to whether or not the second stage will actually happen, which is quite worrying given the level of devastation that we see in Gaza. But in terms of the legalities, really what this is an attempt to completely deprive the Palestinian population in Gaza and the Palestinian people in general of their right to self-determination, which includes independence within their own sovereign state, which would at minimum cover territory occupied by Israel since 1967. And this is long-standing, well-accepted international law at the General Assembly for many years now. And it's also the basis of a two-state solution, which has been the bedrock of United States policy with respect to this conflict for many decades. And so this signals a total departure from, that previous stance.
Yeah, but I've heard some pro-Israel American diplomats saying today, including one or two on Times Radio, the idea that Israel can go back to having this neighbor on its doorstep after October the 7th, 2023, and nothing changes is completely ridiculous. And you can understand where that point of view comes from, because it was the biggest breach of security since the foundation of Israel.
Right. I mean, a lot to say there. Primarily, we don't actually know really where responsibility should lie with respect to the intelligence failure. Certainly, quite a bit of that will lie with the Israeli government and military and security services. We don't have the facts, anything like the full picture of the facts on that right now.
What we
And
do
then
know, though,
secondly,
is what we do know, though, it was a massacre, and which has traumatized them. And of course, now we've had the incredible, the huge retaliation from the Israelis. 47,000
yeah.
dead, could be far more. But the fundamentals of October the 7th remain, that people are saying we cannot give you the chance to do that again.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think really anybody in the international community, in the global north supports Hamas in general. But I think the broader picture here is that Israel is responsible for this creating the unlawful situation in Gaza to begin with. In particular, creating a divide and conquer neo-colonial strategy, right? Separating Fatah and Hamas, and really actually just allowing tons of support and munitions to be funneled to Hamas over many years. And so, I don't think that October 7th is particularly surprising. That's not a justification for the horrible violence that took place this day, on that day. But Israel needs to get real, and the international community needs to get real about the state of Israel's responsibility for the abject position of the Gaza Strip today.
Well, yeah. Well, the Trump administration and his envoys are pretty clear. They support the Netanyahu government. They want the Netanyahu government to perhaps go further than it has dared do before, perhaps even with the West Bank. If somebody wanted to object to these plans, particularly the ones for Gaza, who might that be? Because we've seen what happened with the South Africans and the Irish and others when they petitioned the ICC and the International Court of Justice, should I say, and the response to what they have said. The Israelis say, well, why don't you take them? Who then would international lawyers respond and try and get something done? Who is in the front foot on this?
Yeah, I mean, look, so the first thing is when we talk about taking them or whatever, we're talking about Palestinians, most of whom in Gaza are already refugees since the 1948 war, right? Those people have a right to remain on their homeland, as would any people living on the territory of their homeland, just to be clear about that. Secondly, in terms of concrete actions and responses by states, the UN General Assembly has been crystal clear about the obligations of all states under the current conditions of what it has already determined in concert with the International Court of Justice as being the unlawful military occupation of the entire Palestinian territory, including but not limited to Gaza itself. And so in that connection, states are under an affirmative obligation right now, and have been for some time, not to take actions that aid or assist this continued unlawful occupation, to take proactive economic measures, including sanctions and other sorts of measures, ceasing, of course, the arms trade, et cetera, with Israel. And as we know, there's all sorts of domestic litigation ongoing in the United Kingdom, in Canada, and many other countries in Europe as well, with respect to questions like the arms transfer, which have not been resolved. So really, states need to be proactive here if they're going to discharge themselves of their international legal obligations at this stage.
All right. Heidi Matthews, Professor of International Law at York University in Canada, thank you very much indeed for joining us.